How much money could New Orleans Saints wide receiver Michael Thomas realistically make in a best, worst, and average case scenario? We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints. Part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to subscribe and follow on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss the latest daily episodes. And I'm your host, Ross Jaxon, at Ross Jaxon Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today, Saints Wire, Tuesdays in Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and the official sportsbook of the NFL. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started today. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, how much money did the New Orleans Saints have? How could they spend it? And who are some rookie wide receivers or NFL draft prospect wide receivers you need to know? We'll take a look at that. We'll also discuss two new moves for the New Orleans Saints. The signing of safety Johnathan Abram. How does he fit into the Saints defense? As well as the re-signing of Malcolm Roach. Big move for New Orleans. But first, let's take a look at some Michael Thomas incentive projections for 2023. Now, if you missed it, in yesterday's episode, did a full breakdown of how the incentives all break out when it comes to Michael Thomas and his new contract. So now I want to take all that information and translate it out into some projections. What if he has another 2019 where he goes Super Saiyan Blue and breaks a bunch of records? What happens if he has another rookie year production? What happens if he sits along his average? The first thing that I want to do is just sort of express to you how, I don't want to use the word fickle, but really where these thresholds are. There's a realistic chance for Michael Thomas has a really, really good year and doesn't earn any of these incentives. Now, if this were to happen, best believe that the New Orleans Saints would go out of their way week 17 to just load him, week 18, to just load him up with targets and get him over the hump. But just for instance here, if he appeared in all 17 games, not only on the active roster, but also on the game day roster, he gets the full performance incentive in terms of his availability incentives of $3.74 million. But let's say he has 90 catches, 963 yards. If you consider how often he catches touchdowns on those receptions, 90 catches, he catches a touchdown every 15 catches throughout his career. So we'll call that 6 touchdowns. Pro Bowl, but the Saints don't make the playoffs. No NFL MVP, no Offensive Player of the Year, no first team All-Pro, no Super Bowl MVP. All of a sudden, he gets basically just the $3.74 million for being active on the roster out of the possible $8.74 million that leaves $5 million on the cutting room floor for him, because 90 catches gets him nothing. 930 yards or 963 yards, what's wrong with me, gets him nothing. 6 touchdowns is short of the 7 touchdown threshold. That gets him nothing. And in making a Pro Bowl, but the Saints not making the postseason, nets him nothing. So that's how kind of the thresholds here are set. Now, the Saints, of course, would do everything that they can to make sure that he got over 1,000 yards in that case. But let's look at Michael Thomas's production over the course of his career. His rookie year. 15 games on the active roster, 16 on the 53-man roster. So that means he would get $3.49 million. Now, remember, this is a 16-game season back then, not a 17-game season. So obviously a little bit of money would be on top of all that. 92 catches, so he would not get the reception incentive. 1,137 yards, he would get 2 steps of the, only 1 step of the receptions percentage, or the receiving yards incentive, because it's 1,000 yards, then it's 1,150, and he would come up just shy of 1,150. So he get $250,000 there. 9 touchdowns surpasses the 7 touchdown threshold, another $250,000 there. So he would have gotten $500,000 there, plus the availability incentives, right? So that would, along with his base salary, as well as along with his signing bonus, that would have gotten him up to $10.25 million. Not bad, right? Not bad for that performance at all. Now, I mentioned if he went Super Saiyan Blue and all of a sudden broke all the records again back in 2019, 16 games on the active roster, 149 catches, 1725 in terms of receiving yards, 9 touchdowns, Pro Bowl, and the Saints made the playoffs, so he gets that incentive. First team All-Pro, gets that one. Offensive Player of the Year, gets a milli, just for doing that. So he gets a ton of incentives for that season. So then along with the base salary, along with the signing bonus, out of the total $15 million that he could earn in 2023, that would have gotten him to $13.28 million. What didn't count? No MVP. Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge the 17th game didn't exist at that point. So let's add that on top. So that really puts him at $13.5 million. So the things that didn't count are the Super Bowl MVP, right? No $500,000 incentives there. And then no MVP. So no $1 million incentive there. So that's what comes up short. So the record-setting year, he gets most of that, and he's ready to go. And he's probably commanding a big contract in the offseason, by the way. But let's look at his averages, right? Let's say he appears in every game, all 17 games on the active roster and on the 53-man roster. That's $220,000 per game, $3.74 million. Okay? So let's say he does that. Let's say he does his average, which is 7.2 catches per game over the course of his career. Over 17 games, it's 122 catches. So that means he gets all 3 of the $250,000 incentives there at 100, 110, 120. So he gets $750,000 there. 1,305 yards gets him right over the 1,300 yard threshold to get all 3 yardage incentives. $750,000. The way that I got that number, that he averages 10.7 yards per catch over the course of 124 catches. That's where he ends up. He also, again, catches a touchdown every 15 catches out of 122. That means he gets 8 touchdowns. So he gets that incentive as well. That would very likely get him a Pro Bowl. You would imagine that the Saints are going to the playoffs in that case too. And probably get him first team. You look back to 2018, he had 125 catches, had 1,405 yards. That got him first team All-Pro. So maybe this gets that form, but we're playing make believe. Let's have fun. So he gets first team All-Pro there. So he gets a bunch of those incentives plus his base salary plus his signing bonus and ends up with $12.5 million in terms of his total. That could have been 15 because again, no MVPs, what would be the other thing that was missing? Oh, no offensive player of the year, right? So that's the way that this contract can work. This is great for Michael Thomas. This is great for the New Orleans Saints. But the big thing is, can he get over 100 yards or 100 catches? Can he get over 1,000 yards? Can he get over 7 touchdowns? That's kind of the big piece of getting the performance incentives. And then, of course, staying healthy throughout the season. So that's the way the Michael Thomas contract works. Speaking of numbers, New Orleans Saints have a lot of money still left to spend. We'll get to that in a moment. But first, they started to spend it a little bit with some free agents, bringing in former Raiders safety Johnathan Abram. What is his fit? And how important is it that the New Orleans Saints re-signed defensive tackle Malcolm Roach? Got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sports book and the absolute #1 place you should be going to place your bets, whether that be with the women's and men's college basketball tournament, whether that's in the NBA, whether that's with the NFL. They've got some futures that are up. Saints still the favorite in the NFC South. They're still in the top 5 in terms of favorites in the NFC as a whole. Where will Michael Thomas be when it comes to comeback player of the year voting? There's a whole bunch of stuff that you can get in on, including if you're into the NBA, you can get things like a money line. You can look at point scores, threes drain, and you can bundle all that together in a nice nifty parlay to try to maximize your earnings as well. And of course, if you're a first-time user of FanDuel, you're going to be able to get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That is bonus bets that come back if your first bet doesn't win, meaning that there's no losing on your first bet over at FanDuel. You want more of that? FanDuel.com/locked-on. It's going to get you that no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 in bonus bets. Once again, FanDuel.com/locked-on to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much for making us your first listen of the day every day. So I recorded yesterday's episode, got everything scheduled, ready to go. Everything was good. And then, of course, like an hour after I got everything scheduled, the Saints went out there and signed former Raiders defensive back Johnathan Abram, as well as bringing back Malcolm Roach, defensive tackle. These are good moves for the New Orleans Saints. You could see the Saints really paying attention to their secondary, particularly at safety, which makes a lot of sense, right? Marcus May, he got his alleged aggravated assault case refused by the courts over in Jefferson Parish, and so that's out of the way. But his outstanding DUI from a few years ago when he was still with the Jets, which the Saints signed him with the knowledge that that had happened, right? That had gotten continued all of 2022. Now he's basically going to probably be getting kind of hearing the end of that potentially by the end of this month. So there's a chance that with that DUI, he misses 3 games, maybe appeals 2 games, things like that. We'll see how it goes. But you think about like Deontay Hardy, PJ Williams, a couple of others, those guys all missed 3 games for that. So Marcus May, that's probably what you should expect. So the Saints brought in Lonnie Johnson, who's really a versatile player. In fact, Lonnie Johnson's so versatile, the Saints actually have him listed on their official roster as cornerback. Now, that just could be the position designation by the NFL and keeping it consistent with when he was with the Titans and, you know, the other teams that he was with, Texans and the Chiefs. And so all those little pieces there, but the sort of, you know, caveat or not caveat, but the way to look at it is that really like you can use him all over the place, right? He's kind of your younger PJ Williams, taller, 6'2", over 200 pounds, really athletic. If the ball's near him, he's going to try to make a play on it. Sometimes he can make a play on it. It's a little bit less effective further away from the line of scrimmage, but we're not talking about Lonnie Johnson right now. We're talking about Johnathan Abram. I'm sorry. I love talking about safety play. And that's really what you're going to get from Johnathan Abram, but you're getting a specific brand of safety play. I mean, this guy is a heat-seeking missile. Heck of a tackler. Really good downhill pursuer. So expect him to play in the box because that's where he played a lot, right? He played a ton in the box. And so he could be very valuable to you there, whether you're treating that as a nickel safety or you have a big safety, big nickel package or a big dime package even, so you get both Lonnie Johnson and Johnathan Abram on the field. The big thing is going to be, can you rein him in a little bit? He's a risk taker when it comes to those tackles. You know, you'll probably, I mean, I believe it was the Saints and Raiders game during the pandemic year in Las Vegas, opening up that dome or opening up that new stadium where he like flew into a camera truck or whatever, one of the big scissor lifts and everything, and like got hurt. It was kind of scary for a second. Like, you want to rein him in a little bit. But look, the Saints had that in CJ Garner-Johnson as well, right? CJ was one of those guys that was considered a reckless tackler when he was in college. And I think there's still elements of that you saw sort of permeate into his game in the NFL. But the Saints did a good job of pulling the reins back on that. And I think you could do that with Johnathan Abram as well. There are a lot of people who have asked me, like, will Johnathan Abram make the roster or is he a camp body? Like, let's let the guy get to training camp and see how he actually performs first. But the Saints have no shortage of safeties, right? Like, they're going in all of a sudden wealth of safeties there. Like, you can consider if you add Lonnie Johnson into that number, he's there. And then you add in, just looking at the Saints website, JT Gray, who's technically designated as defensive back, but we know the deal. Smoke Monday, right? Marcus May, Tyrann Mathieu. They added Ugo Amadi earlier this offseason, and then Johnathan Abram. So you've got 7 safeties effectively on this roster right now. And so, look, some of those guys aren't going to make the roster, but some of those guys may also make the roster at a different designation. Don't forget that the Saints carried Marcus May, Tyrann Mathieu, JT Gray, Daniel Sorensen, and PJ Williams all last year, and then had other guys that, you know, shuffled around, but carried those guys all year. And so they had 5 on the roster. So if you look at sort of Marcus May, Tyrann Mathieu, JT Gray as locks for the roster, if Ugo Amadi and Johnathan Abram make the roster, that's still 5 safeties. And then maybe Lonnie Johnson makes it designated as a DB or as a corner, right? So he takes PJ Williams' spot, while guys like Ugo Amadi as well as Johnathan Abram take the Daniel Sorensen spot, and maybe another player that's involved in all of that. So there's a lot of kind of different ways that this can all maybe rumble out, shake out, if you will. But, you know, Johnathan Abram's sort of fit for you is that he can play some free safety. He can play down in the box. You can put him in the slot as well. He spent a little bit over maybe I would say like a quarter maybe of his snaps last year playing from the slot, but also played some free safety and played a lot in the box. So you could think about him maybe as a light linebacker, right? Kind of the Malcolm Jenkins come downhill, make plays underneath kind of role, while Tyrann Mathieu continues to serve deep and things like that. Or Marcus May serves deep, and then you rotate Tyrann Mathieu somewhere else, all of that. So you just think about the physicality of these players too. Like, there's a brand here, kind of like how there's a brand for those defensive tackles that they brought in, Nathan Shepard and Colin Saunders. you can see the brand of safeties that the Saints have brought in, the brand of DBs that they brought in with Ugo Amadi, with Johnathan Abram, with Lonnie Johnson. They want athletic, physical players, and that's what they have brought in. So what does this mean for PJ Williams? We'll see, right? I mean, the Lonnie Johnson signing in particular feels very contentious towards where PJ Williams' role might be, but maybe you bring PJ Williams back and those guys get to battle, right? You give them an opportunity to battle. Same thing for Johnathan Abram. Like, you're probably not going to use him deep and away from the line of scrimmage in those sort of deep coverage situations. So there's still a value of having PJ Williams around in that case. So, at worst, you get a bunch of guys who are able to maybe hold some like depth roles, some solid depth roles. Johnathan Abram's not going to be a starter for you. Lonnie Alexander's not going to be a starter for you. Those guys are not going to start over Marcus May and Tyrann Mathieu when those two players are available. Ugo Amadi, same thing. But do they give you quality depth there? You've got a secondary specialist in Joe Woods. You've got a secondary specialist in Dennis Allen, where you've got a fantastic defensive backs coach, secondary coach in Marcus Robertson. Load up on a strength and get these guys ready. So I love it. The Saints don't just have 2 defensive tackles on their roster anymore, though. They've also now got Malcolm Roach back. Remember, the Saints, according to Nick Underhill over at New Orleans Football, made Malcolm Roach an offer. I believe it was a 2-year offer. Might have been a 1-year offer. Ended up saying, no, I want to test free agency. And then he comes back to a 1-year deal here in New Orleans. So good for New Orleans, because that's somebody that's in that room that they wanted. So they clearly wanted him for a reason. He's a great locker room dude. He's awesome. So he checks the box in terms of the Nathan Shepard and the Colin Saunders part of it all. But then also gives you a sort of, I don't want to call him a seasoned veteran, right? But he knows the system. Like, the guy's not old, right? He knows the system. And if you remember, I mean, if you've been rocking with Locked on Saints for a long time, you remember Delvin Breaux years ago, I keep rhyming, on the show, was here, and he mentioned that like Malcolm Roach was the undrafted free agent for that class to watch. And that was at the same time where everyone was going nuts over Chase Hansen being an undrafted free agent, right? And then so all of a sudden you have now Malcolm Roach, who's come back and now he's a part of your team again. So you get sort of the continuity that the Saints value so much at a position where they're still shaking things up. So that's a really good balance that we haven't seen the Saints take that approach before, but they are now. So good fits, good moves for the New Orleans Saints. We'll see where it all ends up, but you can see the logic behind the moves that they're making. Coming up next, how much money did the New Orleans Saints have? What should they spend it on? And some wide receivers for you to know from this year's draft. We got that coming up for you on today's episode. And wrapping up today's episode of Locked on Saints, part of Locked on Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it. Who Dat Nation, wrapping up today's episode of Locked on Saints. The New Orleans Saints started this offseason at $47+ million over the salary cap. And right now, they are in the top 10. Top 10. Let me say it again. Top 10 in salary cap space still available. This is after signing Derek Carr. This is after signing Jamal Williams, Colin Saunders, Nathan Shepard, bringing back pieces, Michael Thomas, bringing back, I guess you could say bringing back Jameis Winston, right? There's a bringing back aspect to that, but also getting Jameis Winston to stay, getting Andrew Speak to take a pay cut and bringing all these other guys back, signing some of these other guys that we've discussed today, and Lonnie, I always want to say Lonnie Anderson, Lonnie Johnson, and Johnathan Abram, and Ugo Amadi, all these players that they brought in, Storm Norton. And so where should the Saints be spending the money that they have? Well, how much do they have? So over the cap has them at $16.4 million over the cap, no pun intended. Now, effective cap space, which means you're kind of accounting for draft class and things like that, like the upcoming money that you're going to need for the draft class based upon where the draft picks currently are, sits at about $13.2 million. So that puts the Saints at 9th place in both of those across the NFL. I know the salary cap nerds are mad. I know they are. Well, technically, I'm the salary cap nerd in this situation, but I know the anti-salary cap nerds are angry. But that's okay. Where should the New Orleans Saints spend this money, however, right? Now, keep in mind, too, I want to make sure that I say this out loud, too. The Saints have been the 3rd biggest spenders in free agency so far. A wealth of that was the quarterback contract, obviously, right? $150 million in total, all those other things. And so that takes into account not just how much money they spent in first years of deals, but the full lifespan of deals combined amongst all these players. So all 3 years of the 2 DTs, all 3 years of the running back, all 3 years of the quarterback, so on and so forth. So they spent the third most money in free agency this year. And a lot of people will tell you that like winning the offseason doesn't mean winning in season, which is true, but spending doesn't necessarily mean winning, right? Like the Saints aren't going out there making big splash signings. They made like one big splash signing and then they've made really good economically splash signings, right? And you look at the four of the 5 teams that spent the most money last year, which included the Bills, the Jets, the Dolphins, the Chargers, and one other team. 4 out of those 5, the Jets being the only exception, all made the playoffs in the AFC last year. So spending money doesn't mean much, right? Or winning the offseason doesn't mean much, but spending money to make your team better in the offseason certainly says something. So the Saints are the 3rd highest spenders, but they also still have the 9th most cap space in the NFL available. So good job, Kai Harley. Where should they spend that money? Well, tight end was a big one, right? And it looked like maybe Foster Moreau was going to get signed, but crazy news with Foster Moreau that we've seen here in New Orleans before. He goes in for a routine physical with the team and then learns that he's got Hodgkin's lymphoma. So now he begins this battle with cancer, and that could potentially be a life-saving diagnosis. That's like the 3rd time since 2017 something like this has happened in New Orleans. John Dornbos, they brought him in, long snapper, got him into his physical, bam, found out that he had a condition that, a very serious condition that he was then able to, I think, kind of retired from the NFL. He went on Ellen, told the story and all this other stuff. And then, is great today. Nick Fairley, they found a heart condition in him back in 2017. So yikes, but so all the best, by the way, to Foster Moreau. So the Saints clearly looking to spend some money there at tight end. Do they have many tight end options out on the market? Not necessarily, right? It's not a super exciting market now at tight end. Austin Hooper just signed elsewhere. Mercedes Lewis, Cameron Brate, some of these guys are still out, and this might not even be updated. I might have missed some of these signings. There's some places that they could still go, but maybe they don't look to spend that money in free agency any longer, and they look to the draft. So maybe continuing to shore up the defensive line, bringing in a guy like Austin Bryant on the edge, or maybe a Yannick Ngakoue, somebody we talked about a few days ago. There's still places to spend that money, and they could also spend that money to bring Kentavius Street back and add him, get 2 continuity pieces on the defensive tackle spot, which would be great for them. So there's a lot of places where they can funnel that money. They could still go to wide receiver as well and look to see what they can find there. They can go to linebacker to continue to shore up some depth. They've gotten the safety depth taken care of. I think we can stop talking about that now. But there's a lot of places where they could still spend that money. But it's going to be interesting to see exactly where they do. Marvin Jones, DJ Chark, in terms of wide receivers, they could potentially go after all of that. The last thing I wanted to do today, because it is Thursday, and every Thursday we break down some draft prospects, but I want to make sure you got that salary cap thing. Like if anybody asks you, how are the Saints salary cap doing? You tell them just fine. Top 10. They'll be all right. And don't worry, they'll spend that money. They'll spend that money. They only have 65 spots in their 90-man roster completely filled out, so they're far from done before the draft. A couple of wide receivers that I wanted to make sure that I brought up today, as we, kind of usually focus on draft prospects on Thursdays, but today kind of got a little shaken up with the big news, with new signings, all those other things. But the Saints could go early for a wide receiver, right? And that doesn't necessarily mean first round. Like guys like Josh Downs, guys like Zay Flowers, they could potentially be pushed into the second round because there's an edge rusher run that's expected. There's how early do the quarterbacks go? There's 2 cornerback runs that are expected in this year's draft. There's a DT run expected in this year's draft. So depending on kind of where those things go, you could end up with a pretty premier wide receiver being there at 40 or being there close enough for you to trade up at the top of the second day. So guys like Zay Flowers out of Boston College, guys like Josh Downs out of UNC, they don't really fit the mold of a Saints receiver, although things are a little bit different now, right? Like the Saints drafted Chris Olave. He came in at under 100 pounds. One of their main contributors last year was Rashid Shaheed. He was undrafted, of course, but came in at under 100 pounds. But in terms of like who they usually invest draft picks on, 6 foot or above, 6'1" plus, and then over 200 pounds is usually what they do. Kawaan Baker, Traquan Smith, Michael Thomas, all examples. Obviously, Brandon Cooks was an exception with world-class speed. Chris Olave, also an exception, also with world-class speed. So maybe that's really the big difference there. And some of those guys that I just mentioned, UNC's Josh Downs, Boston College's Zay Flowers, like these guys are no slowpokes at all, right? They bring in slowpoke. They bring in, high class speed, maybe not world class speed, but big time speed. And are players that are playmakers. And like I've said many times here on the show, Saints coach told me they want to bring in 2 playmakers in this year's draft. So if they do that, like go early, then those might be names that they end up going after. Now, it'd be wonderful for them to walk away with a Jaxon, Smith-Njigba. The Saints sent 8 different coaches, including Mickey Loomis, including Dennis Allen, to or personnel members to and Jeff Ireland as well, to the Ohio State Pro Day on Wednesday. And they weren't there looking at CJ Stroud. So, unless they're looking at who they might face if Carolina drafts them. But Jaxon Smith-Njigba would be excellent too. So like those are kind of the top of the draft guys. A middle of the draft guy that I would say to watch out for, along with a guy that I've talked about a ton here on the show, A.T. Perry out of Wake Forest, big, long, matches the prototype, has really good speed. Dylan Sanders just did a great breakdown on him, or draft profile on him, over at Saints Wire, worth checking out. But would be Parker Washington. He's a wide receiver out of Penn State. Comes in a little bit undersized in terms of height, 5'11", but over 200 pounds. Great catch radius, fantastic hands. Great, in terms of contested catches. Had forced 31 broken tackles or missed tackles forced over the course of the past couple of years. He's kind of got that Kawan Baker thing, but at kind of an earlier draft prospect, right? That it turns into a running back with the ball in his hands and it just kind of bowls over people, runs through contact, all that. So really, really solid stuff. And I think he's hovering around 70% plus when it comes to contested catch rate over the past couple of years as well. So he's been excellent there. So all worth looking at when it comes to Penn State wide receiver Parker Washington. The next one that I would mention or the next pair that I'll mention are guys that we've talked about here on the show before that are of similar molds, right? Matt Landers, 6'3", 200 plus pounds, 4.4 speed, really, really fast, great catch radius, big guy, could do a little better in contested catch situations, but still there. And then West Virginia's Bryce Ford-Wheaton, who has a similar size, similar build, similar speed, right? So big, height, weight, speed guys that can go up and get it for you. Could be a little bit better in contested catch situations. They're not the Jaxon Smith-Njigbas of the world. They're not the Parker Washingtons of the world, but they can get you there and you can help to get them there as well. So those are maybe some wide receivers to watch just at different parts of the draft. That's your day 1, day 2, day 3 guys. So just as a recap, your day 1 guys could be like a Jaxon Smith-Njigba tumbles unexpectedly. A Zay Flowers or a Josh Downs if the Saints are in love with him. Keeping in mind that size doesn't always dictate it, right? Even when Sean Payton was in the building, Devonta Smith was their wide receiver 1 on the board that year, and Jamar Chase was on the board that year. So worth mentioning. Your day 2 guys, Parker Washington, A.T. Perry. Parker Washington out of Penn State, A.T. Perry out of Wake Forest. And then your day 3 guys, Bryce Ford-Wheaton out of WVU, as well as, of course, Matt Landers out of Arkansas. So just some names to keep in mind. And we'll continue to break all those down. We have a fun time here, of course, with Mock Draft Monday and all that. All right, coming up on tomorrow's episode, it's Friday, so we'll get into In Case You Missed It. Make sure you have all the news from the week. And, of course, keep you up to date with everything else that the New Orleans Saints are probably going to do as soon as I'm done recording this episode. Don't forget, we have the subtext for you. Join subtext.com/LockedOnSaints to join, where you get some one-on-one conversation with me, some inside insight, things like that. And I want to start a new thing to where you guys record the exit or the outro from my show, and I want you to start closing out the show here on Locked On Saints. So we'll do that a couple times a week, depending upon how many I get. We could do multiple times. I might save them and do once a week. We'll see how many I get. But basically, starting the intro from "Thank you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine," all the way through, I'll holla at you. And I would love for y'all to close out the show. Just make sure when you shoot it sideways, right? Turn it horizontal. Make sure you get it. Make sure you get it right for me. And then you can send it to my Gmail address. That way you can use, whatever transfer you need to, including Google Drive. Ross Jackson, ASC, from all the way back in my All Saints Considered days. Ross Jackson, ASC at gmail.com. Appreciate y'all, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL Scouting. Kyle Krabs, Joe Marino, walking you through what it takes to build a successful NFL franchise every single Monday through Friday. Find it wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube as well. This is where I would want you to start the intro, right here, or the outro. I'm a nerd. Thank you so much, as always, for making me part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you living. Let me know how your mom and them. And trust Who Dat Nation. I'll holla at you.